That brings us to number 7, Attorney Richard Saudek, on a possible proposal between Iberdrola and Town of Grafton, and the process to get to that. So, Richard, could you come up and use the mic, please?
Okay, stand near the act.
I'll bring the mic to you.
I'm concerned about this. I do want to clarify a couple of things. I've never, ever represented a developer. Not a wind developer, not a hydro developer. I've represented the town of Rockingham, the town of Somerset, the town of Whitingham in litigation against TransCanada. And I have represented towns of Sheffield and Lowell, and to a lesser degree, Searsburg and Reedsboro, and I represent a couple of towns who are involved in these cables that come under the lake. I've never represented a developer. And I don't plan to start now. I'd like to kind of set the stage a little bit. The Vermont legislature has made this state extraordinarily attractive to developers of renewable energy projects. That almost goes without saying. You've heard a lot about that. But when you think of an outfit like Iberdrola, who sits there in Spain or wherever they sit, and looks at the world, the map of the world, and decides that little old Vermont is a good place to come and develop their renewable project, there's a reason for that. And that is that it gets very favorable rate treatment here. There are incentives built in. And they think they'll get favorable siting treatment here. There's no particular reason why they should, particularly with a proposal of this size. This would be, as you probably know, if it were built, and compared to the other ones that have been built, it would be by quite a bit, I guess by about 50%, the largest wind farm in the state. So, you know, I will tell you that when I heard that they were thinking of putting a 96 megawatt development in Grafton, I just kind of shook my head and laughed. I mean, I didn't expect that it would, frankly, go very far. So I simply want you to understand that that's kind of where I come from. I consider it my charge tonight to tell you the way towns have approached these things and the way at least some towns have worked out agreements. Some towns, the agreements, one of the towns I was involved with, we kind of chased the developer out of town, but that was a very small one, up in Derby. The larger ones, Sheffield and Lowell, have been built, and they are going along, as you all know. And it's no secret about particularly the problems at Lowell, and it's no secret about some of the noise problems at Sheffield. I guess I would start. What I've done for my own kind of reference, I've made a kind of an outline of the issues that get addressed in these contracts when they go to contract with the developers. And the first one is by far the most important, and that is a project description. There is no reason, well, let me start by saying they need you. You can kind of split hairs and parse the statutes and so on and say, well, the Public Service Board can in fact overrule towns. And the statute that they just passed does not quite go all the way for you. But I believe, and I may be wrong, but I believe that in the atmosphere of Montpelier now, the Public Service Board would be extremely stupid, if not, I think crazy, to overrule a strong sentiment in the town. If there were strong sentiment against it in the town, I think the PSB would listen to that and not just take it into account. I think they probably go, and Iberdrola knows that. That's why Iberdrola has PR people here. I don't know whether anybody around here is from Iberdrola. I don't recognize any of the usual Montpelier crowd. But at any rate, that is why they are, kind of here all the time and working on you. They need you, and make no mistake about it. So one of the first things is, if, number one, you can vote the thing down and be done with it. Number two, if you think that it should be changed significantly, then you should tell them it. Cut it back, put them in more remote places, whatever, than they have. They've done that. They made some considerable adjustments in Sheffield, and in response to public pressure. And they just got to do it. I mean, they don't have much choice. You have to feel comfortable with it. I really believe that. If you have a decent advocate at the Public Service Board, you're ready to go against it. On the other hand, they're going to want a contract probably before they go there. So you start out with a project description, and the size and configuration of the wind machines is important, and you really ought to get into the detail of that with them if you're even thinking, or if they're thinking, or wanting an agreement. I would suggest, having been here at this meeting since pretty close to the beginning, I see that there's a certain amount of debate in this town, and not always headed in the same direction, but maybe you can figure out a way to express yourself on that. I think it's important. Probably another consideration, if you do go to a contract, is the length of the contract. Wind projects, nobody really knows how long they're going to go. They tend to make these deals for about 20 or 25 years. The wind developers try to back them up with contracts, because they get these favorable contracts, and they can afford to throw off that money. And so that, I don't know whether it would be 25, 30, 20 years, that would, it probably wouldn't go an awful lot longer though, because these machines wear out, they break, and so on. Noise, at the early stages of wind, I think nobody really appreciated the noise problem with wind machines. Now it's front and center. And, I think there are different ways to approach it. One way, I think there are certain experts that the town needs, and one of them, probably the most important one, would be a sound expert. Sound is so difficult to understand and define. I have to do a full course in it every time I do this, but anybody who's tried to kind of measure dBAs and LEQs and L90s and all these things that the sound experts talk about, you really need an expert, and you need somebody who has good equipment, good backup, good credentials, so that Iberdrola's representatives and engineers can't just blow that person off and say, you know, he doesn't know what he's talking about, or she doesn't know what she's talking about. You really have to have somebody who can go toe to toe with them, and there are not many people who can. I mean, sound experts are good. Sound experts a little hard to find, but it's worth it. And then that person takes ambient readings. You know, maybe at various locations with something this size, it probably would be a number of locations, and it probably would stretch over a fair period of time, at night and day, possibly even, you know, going different seasons. I would assume, without really knowing that much about this area, I've only been here, you know, for these meetings and stuff, but I would assume that the ambient sound is very quiet here. I mean, I would assume that you don't have truck traffic and things that other towns often have. You don't have an interstate right nearby anyway, and so it's probably very quiet. You kind of have to know what you're willing to put up with. The Public Service Board has not handled sound very well. They've had a lot of pressure about sound since it became an issue after a couple of wind farms went up. And they still are kind of struggling to get sound standards. The legislation that went through, I honestly haven't seen the final version, and I don't know what it said. It went through a whole bunch of different drafts, and it just got kind of hopelessly complicated. It had a lot of lobbyists involved. I would say probably mostly for the renewable energy sector, and unfortunately, in this situation, the renewable energy sector is kind of the enemy of sound standards when it comes to you know, sensible development. So the sound, the one, they seem to kind of flirt around 45 dBA at property lines or at the nearest home. 45 is it's pretty high sound for the middle of the night in Vermont. My understanding is that it's not too bad in the middle of the day compared to sound that's just around you, but in the middle of the night you can hear it. And but there is another characteristic, of course, about sound, and that is distance. And what you want to do, though, just to move off it and move along, you want to set standards and agree on standards. You don't want something where the PSB may undermine you, but you want to be able to put before the PSB something that's a fairly strict standard on sound. And you want to be absolutely sure that it's going to be monitored after it's up, and if they don't meet the sound standards, there are going to have to be consequences. What are those consequences in a wind farm? It's a little hard to say. We haven't really gotten to that point. And, you know, I suppose the biggest consequence might be they might have to shut down a couple of turbines or something like that, that are unacceptable in sound at a certain distance from the machine. It's a tricky area. It's a tricky drafting area for lawyers, but it's mainly a tricky area for sound people and people to comprehend. That's why I'm spending so much time on it. I'm going to pass up money for a moment. I'll circle back to it. There's always a money element in these things, but I think it's important to talk about some of the other things, because these are not just money agreements. Communications, I've always insisted that there be somebody available 24/7 who can respond to complaints, emergencies, you know, the sorts of things that come up. I would imagine, without really knowing, but with a wind farm of this size, they would expect to have at least some workers in the vicinity. It's kind of on and off as on these projects, whether they expect them to more or less run by themselves or not. But this is a big farm, and this, if it's anything like 96 megawatts, I would think they would. And you would want to insist that person, that everybody has that person's number, is posted in town and so on, and that that person be of sufficient authority to be able to take action, not just, you know, some worker who's way down the line, that person have enough authority to be able to work with it. Prior approval of plans. The other surprise as these wind things have developed, and I'm sure that you've probably seen this, since I understand that a lot of you have made yourselves pretty sophisticated in this area, but one of the other surprises is what it does to roads. In order to bring those things in, they need big roads, and I mean big roads, because they are big things that bring it in. They also build them very fast. Once they get a certificate, once they get permission, they come in like gangbusters. It's a special, these are special crews that are like under contract with the manufacturers. They know what they're doing. They come zooming in and they, you know, they just do it in a hurry. You've got to be ready for that. You've got to make sure that you understand and that you have signed off in advance, and you can put this in a contract and you can enforce it, that you've signed off in advance where and what kind of roads, what sorts of rules will govern the infrastructure, you know, whether it's drainage, stormwater, or sewage, or whatever, bridges, whatnot. You can get pretty detailed. So I have provided that the towns get prior sign-off on construction at a certain number of days ahead of it, or weeks ahead of it, or even months in some respect, in some situations. Usually your road commissioner has a pretty good idea of what they're talking about and can figure out what works and what doesn't work in the town. The impacts on private property. This is a really tricky area. Most people want their neighbors not to suffer as a result of these developments. And they want to, and they have a perfectly legitimate concern, even if they aren't going to see the things and they're not going to hear the things and so on. They have a perfectly legitimate concern that their neighbors not be, you know, that their property not be devalued, that they not be constantly bothered by these things. And that's a tough one to solve. I'll tell you, I have tried to tell towns with very limited success that I think the town itself should be very careful about wading in there, because I don't think it's in the interest of the town in general to get between a private claim against a developer and the developer, because the town can get itself into all kinds of complications there. And so the best I can say is that the developer, and if the developer will know, the developer by now knows who the neighbors are, how far they are, what kind of land they have, what their houses are assessed at. You can bet all that stuff is available to them by now. I mean, they've been hanging around this town for quite a while. And so if they can work out a way to work that out, with the private landowners. One would hope they would. Now, we now have the town of New Haven where a cable's coming up there, and they're going to put, or they want to put, this is by no means a foregone conclusion, they want to put a what they call a converter station, which is a special kind of substation there to take a big slug of power, 400 megawatts. And there's real concern in the town about the neighbors, that this thing is going to have a hum to it, you know, the way substations do. And it's going to devalue their property. And the solution that New Haven came up with was to have, to put $1 million in a letter of credit from the company, in effect reserve $1 million, and then have a kind of a landowner's appraiser, and if the company disagreed, the company's appraiser, but this would happen after the thing was in place, after the substation was in place. There's no perfect way to solve that problem, I think. I've tried a number of ways. Often the developer will just kind of make it go away. The developer will make private deals with private landowners, possibly even buy the place or whatever. So I can't tell you that there's any perfect solution on that. Do you mind if I go a little longer? I don't know what's but how much time you have. So there are a few things that look like boilerplate to people when they read the contract, but in fact they are important. The contract binds successors and assigns. Well, they flipped these projects. And I would be willing to bet anybody in the room that within 5 years after this, if this project gets built, I'd be willing to bet that in 5 years somebody else will own it. They flip them, and I've seen them actually just sell permits, and then the new person goes and builds them. The problem with that obviously is that the successor has to live by the contract. The way we handle that, which isn't, I found a pretty good way, is we go into the Public Service Board and we ask the Public Service Board to write the contract right into the license, right into the Certificate of Public Good, so that if anybody is operating it and violates the contract, they've violated the license to operate, and they can be shut down. And the Public Service Board, I believe, would shut them down. I don't know any other way to do it, frankly. I mean, you could talk about putting up bonds, and you can talk about, you know, various evidences of financial solvency to back the contract or something like that. But I think the best way and the crispest way to do it is to write right into the Certificate of Public Good. Well, I say everyone I've done in the moment, I haven't done that many, but they've all been, we've insisted on having them in, and the board is willing to do that. There are a bunch of miscellaneous terms. Iberdrola is an international corporation. I don't know whom you're dealing with. You're probably dealing with a Delaware limited liability company that is only for the purposes of building this thing or something. They tend to be pretty complicated setups, these corporations. So you want to make sure that it's enforceable in Vermont courts, that they have subjected themselves to the jurisdiction of the state, and that the wherewithal for the Public Service Board to enforce has been set up. And you don't want to just
give up everything to arbitration. You've all heard probably about these new laws now where they're talking about the banks writing arbitration clauses into credit cards and so on. That doesn't work. You want to be able to enforce it in a Vermont court and haul them in here rather than they're running to Delaware or something like that. The maintenance and fire protection. With wind projects, as opposed to some of the other ones, that's a real concern. I don't know what kind of fire department you have, but if you have a kind of a typical Vermont volunteer fire department or kind of one that covers mutual aid or whatever, we have gotten the developers to, outside of other financial terms, we've gotten the developers to finance special training and special equipment that might come into into use if something happens in the wind machines. And of course, anytime you're having a machine with things going around, something can and probably will happen sooner or later. And it can be a real emergency. Something can happen in substations. I understand there's is it a 345 line out here where they want to put it? Two 345 lines. Okay, yeah, of course. Yeah, it's the double circuit they put in the so-called Vermont reliability. Huh? So that, okay. And incidentally, just parenthetically, this is what they call, in power terms, this is what they call a merchant plant. It's not owned by a utility, and it doesn't serve utility customers. They sell either with what they call, with bilateral contracts to utilities, or as often as not, they will sell into the New England grid and take what they can get out of that. My guess would be that it's not very economical for them to develop this thing without getting some power contracts with utilities who are willing to pay the premiums for renewable power and all the renewable energy credits and the tax credits that kind of travel along with it. And that's why it is desirable for the developers. Let's go back for a second to money. There's no, well, there is a rule of thumb that I usually start with, which was actually established in the first one, the Sheffield project, just to give you an idea of order of magnitude of the money. I don't know anything about your annual budget or your tax rate or any of that stuff. I have used a rule of thumb, or at least these guys. Sandy Rockwell represent these guys?
I've heard that name.
Or Jeff Dands, or one of those guys?
I've heard that name.
Yeah, okay. They know in other contracts that I've gotten that it runs to 13,000 a megawatt. Do the math, that's about $1.25 million a year. To give you an example, Sheffield is 520,000 they get a year, and their annual budget is about 400,000. And typically for the Northeast Kingdom, they put the rest of it into savings and don't touch it. As a matter of fact, they don't even cover their annual budget. They just cut the taxes in half and they put more in savings. Keeping that on down so that they can continue to have that money probably perpetually after the contract runs out. And Lowell is in the same general category, but their annual budget is higher, but they cover their annual budget. Now, the way that works, though, is you have the basic property taxes on the project. You then have what we call a supplemental payment. and you set an amount, say $1.25 million, for the total, so that their taxes are inside that total. So the extra money that you get for the town is not the $1.25 million, say, if you got $1.25 million or $1 million or something like that. The extra money that would include their property taxes. I haven't the foggiest notion where their property taxes would be, but that's a calculation that is, you can kind of do a rough calculation on that, because it'll change your tax rate considerably. But so you value it every year, and it's not a tax stabilization agreement. Tax stabilization agreements are a pain in the neck to get through, and they have to create lots of jobs. You have to show this and show that. So you avoid a tax stabilization agreement. They change depending on the number of kilowatt hours that they generate, and the value of it changes. But for tax purposes, but the total amount stays the same and preferably escalates over time. I don't know. Oh yeah. Well, what do you give it? What would you give up for this? I mean, what's the quid pro quo? And what you give up is you support the contract. You support the project in conformance with the contract, and normally, if a town decides to do this and go along with it, what I've done in the past is I'll put on a member of the select board, and that person will say, well, here's the contract, we're asking the public service board, write this in the certificate of public good, and that's about it. From then on, you kind of let go, and unless some glitch comes up as you're going along with the public service board, you don't generally have to have a lawyer sitting there in these hearings, which are usually pretty long. The Public Service Board is the ultimate authority. There are, in matters like decommissioning these plants, which, that's the big issue with Vermont Yankee. Well, pulling them apart and taking them down, and they got a great verb for it, greenfielding them. The Public Service Board usually sets fairly stringent conditions on decommissioning, but there's no reason why that couldn't be handled in the contract as well. It's just that, at that point it begins to get a little advisory. I mean, you get all the environmental agencies weigh in on stormwater and the kinds of things that it's difficult to foresee in every contract. But there's no reason you can't work with the state agencies on it. That's another thing that I've done, is generally keep in close touch with the state agencies and not go in there with the developers. I mean, I think you should have a lawyer who knows the state agency people and makes them conversant in what the interests of the town are, and finds out whether the state agencies disagree with the town. You want to kind of get an early warning on that. Okay, the last thing, and then I'll be quiet and hopefully you'll have no questions. The last thing is how do you express the town's opinion on it? One thing that is important is whether you have Australian ballot. If you have Australian ballot, okay. Well, that's helpful because then people can vote Australian ballot, and they don't have to stand up and raise their hands and so on. But then you would notice a regular special town meeting, or this is what we're doing in New Haven. I don't know how it's going to come out. In New Haven, we have let it be known all over town that there is going to be a vote. There have been 3 informational hearings on the proposed agreement in which we have presented the people with a term sheet, which is a fairly specific document of the basic terms of the contract. It doesn't have the jurisdictional stuff, but some of the little details, but the basics of the contract are in the term sheet. And then we've had informational hearings and things have been explained, and then people will have an informal kind of advisory vote on it. And it's not a regular town meeting, it's not a special town meeting, it's not noticed. They don't have Australian ballot, so what we've set up is that for one day, people can deposit written slips at the clerk's office. I don't know whether you have a lot of second homeowners here, but as a practical matter, probably it wouldn't just be regular residents unless you decided to have a regular town meeting and just do the citizens of the town. I mean, that's up to you. As with Iberdrola in this town, the people the developers in New Haven have said they won't go ahead without it. I think Al's concern is real. They do flip these projects, and they sell a package that says this is what our Met Towers have shown, and you know, give us the money and sayonara. But I mean, it's not one could get pretty skeptical of renewable power watching what has happened in this state. Anyway, I guess, oh yeah. One other thing, sorry. How do you negotiate? The way I've done it, and which has worked, I think, very well, is to have a minority of the select board, so you don't have a quorum every time you come together, have the select board, preferably probably one person who's generally inclined to listen to it, and the other person who's generally inclined against it, because you really don't want to just get rolled by it. And then possibly a lister who will know the kind of tax implications and be able to calculate those, you know, in her or his head. And and possibly one other person from the town. Don't want to overload it, because these things, there's a lot of talk on every issue. There's a lot of negotiation. I mean, it's a pretty strenuous process, and you've got to bring in the sound person, you've got to bring in the technical people. There are plenty of people who know about wind farms now, I think, and so there are not that many who know about what they want to put in New Haven, but wind farms are pretty well established down in the east. People know. I guess that's all. Whatever.
Richard, well, one of the questions I would have is, you talked about a sound person and different experts that we would need to work with, that we would hire, the town would hire to work with. I wasn't on the select board last year, but I attended meetings. I know there was not a lot of money in the budget to hire expertise. I'm guessing other towns have been in a similar situation to Grafton. How do they fund it?
Okay. The way they're doing it in New Haven is kind of a refinement on previous ones. What they did in New Haven was we got the developer to put money in escrow which is held by a lawyer who has nothing to do in the escrow account of a law firm that has nothing to do with the case. And the town gets bills from its expert, okays the bills, sends it to the escrow agent, the lawyer, who pays it. So there is no, you know, the developer doesn't see the bills, and the developer doesn't know what the bills are. It seems to be working pretty well. At first, they refused to pay me. They didn't like me, the developer, and so they said, "Well, we'll pay the other experts whom they didn't know." They figured somebody they didn't know was better than paying me. So then finally, apparently, some other lawyer in some other town they were doing business with got them, persuaded them to let the lawyer be paid out of the escrow fund. So they finally changed their minds. But at any rate, the point is that there can be no fooling around if the expert is working for the town. But if the expert, whether it's an engineer or a lawyer or a sound person or whomever, I mean, a wetlands expert, an environmental expert, a person who does the simulations where the company always shows you your ridge lines with these faint white little thingies sticking out. And, you want somebody who's going to give you a realistic idea of what the views are and from where, and what are going to be the most sensitive view sheds and so on. You probably, with wind, you really need that. With some of the other kinds of developments, it's not quite as essential, but you absolutely have to have it, and particularly a farm this size. So, yeah, I think the escrow thing is working pretty well. I have had one other arrangement where they didn't need, or they didn't think they needed, now they know they needed them, sound people, like in Sheffield. But, well, Sheffield just paid me straight. Others, there was another one, I forget which one it was. Oh yeah, Benson, where another cable comes up out of the lake. Benson said they wanted the developer to reimburse them for my bills, and I just said, I don't want to hear about it. You do whatever deal you're going to do with the developer. I don't want to hear about it. I'm going to give you a letter saying that whether they're paying you through the back door or not, it's not my concern. I represent the town. And I think any lawyer that you might hire would feel very strongly that he or she would have to be independent to represent the town. I mean, these guys don't kid around. I mean, you can't have kind of divided loyalties. I'm going to buy you a big stake. Take it to the inn at Grafton. You decided. Huh? Yeah.
When you talked about the money of $1 million, whatever, that's over the whole project.
No, it's a year.
Yeah, a year, but Grafton only has 8 of the 28 towers, so they were offering us 200.
Yeah, I think
that would be your whole project.
I would assume that would be the whole project if you were trying to do a rule of
So
thumb.
it doesn't sound like a lot of money for a lot of projects.
That's your judgment. I mean, you know.
I'm asking your judgment.
Well, what I'm trying to say is, if you want to know what their expectations are, and I'm sure that they will probably, they're either here listening or they've got the place mic'd. But I suspect their expectations are probably in that range.
Well, that's what they offered us already.
Have they offered you what amounts to, what was it?
What was it?
What they offered?
It comes to about $10,000 a megawatt.
Yeah, okay, so then we got, they figure, okay, well, we'll go to 15.
Seems like a lot of problems for number.
Okay, so, all right, yeah. So what you might want to tell them is,
So
yeah, okay, we'll take the money, but half the windows
Or go away.
go away. Go away.
Go
Good, you know, I mean, it's definitely an option.
Thank you.
What's the timeline in doing this? It would seem to me if you were going to do all this negotiating, at what point do you want to have an agreement that you can look at? Before the town takes its vote, before it goes to the Public Service Board, I would think. But what's your advice? Where should we be in this?
You want a basic agreement definitely before the town takes its vote, because the town should know what the agreement's
That's
going
what
to
I wanted to hear. Thank you.
I mean, you know, some of you may be familiar with Guys and Dolls, you know, where Big Julie from Chicago hands the dice to Detroit to roll, and Detroit looks at the dice and says, these dice ain't got no spots. And Big Julie says, yeah, I remember where the spots formerly was. Well, I mean, you're going to want to know.
I'll still respect it in the morning. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
They're not even in the ISO yet, so how can we negotiate with them?
The SIS, you mean?
They're not even
ISO.
the New England ISO.
Well,
So we don't know what.
that won't be a big problem for them to be in the, let me just, there are a couple of terms that you should know. ISO stands for Independent System Operator, which to us old timers means NEPOOL. It's the New England Power. And they run, they do a lot of things. They stabilize the system, they make sure that plants turn on and off and so on to meet the load and whatnot. In the most economical way for everybody, supposedly. There are a lot of differences in that, but there are a lot of footnotes to that. But with you know, going into the ISO would not be a huge thing. But what is what is called the System Impact Study. An SIS, and you'll hear that term if you get anywhere into this. And that is a study that the independent system operator does to see what happens when they inject power into the grid at this place. So they build the substation, they hop onto the wire here, they like the fact that there are 2, 3, 45 wires here, because those are the biggest you're going to get in Vermont, and they get on the grid. Where do those little electrons go? I mean, you can't really. So the first thing you learn about power is you can't tell the electrons where to go. You make contracts to govern them, but the people who have to run the grid have to decide whether it's safe to inject power at that place, and if so, where it will go. And that, as you can imagine, is a very complicated study. And they can't get approval to run their project. They probably wouldn't even start construction on it until they've got an SIS. And up in Lowell, Green Mountain ran into some problems with that. NEPOOL started not counting the power and saying that they were putting too much in at the wrong times and so on. And they got into a lot of problems. So they tend to wait until they get that system impact study from the ISO, and that takes quite a while. It's complicated. Meanwhile, they'll go into the state process. So at least that's the way the lawyers who represent Iberdrola here have done it in other projects. They'll start the regulatory process going, and what they do is they have to give a 45-day warning. You've probably heard about this, a 45-day notice before they actually file their case. But that starts the process ticking. It would be best, and I think they would prefer it to, if they're going to do it, and if you're going to agree to it, and so on, I think it would be best for them to have that in place, your agreement in place, or at least have a vote before they file the 45-day notice with the PSB. Yes, sir.
How is the contracts that you've written for the other towns help the people who've been harmed in those towns? I mean, those are town contracts, I guess, that have been written. Those people who've been harmed in those towns. Is those contracts protecting those people?
Generally speaking, those contracts with the towns don't cover individual harm and individual claims. And this has come up in Sheffield with the Therians, with the people who live near used to live near the wind machine there. And they felt the town should get in the middle of it and actually take some of their money, the town money, and pay them for their damages. The position I've taken, quite frankly, is that, and it may sound heartless and it may sound tough, but the position I've taken is that it is not good for the town to get in the middle of those disputes. If they can sue, if they've got a nuisance claim, if they can't work it out with the company, if they can't get the company to buy them out, they can sue or make whatever claim they may have against the company. It would be best if the whole thing were designed beforehand to try, if at all possible, to avoid that kind of thing. But, you know, to be honest, I think it's a slippery slope if the town gets between those claims and the developer. I think the developer should have to take care of that stuff.
I think it's unfortunate that the town, the developer is willing to pay the town for an attorney to negotiate a contract, but then leaves these poor fellows who can't afford to defend in an inappropriate situation where they have to abandon their home.
I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, I'm familiar with the case, and I don't know what else to tell you. I think my own feeling is that the other side of the story is that the towns, with all good intentions, get themselves into they get themselves in the middle of lawsuits, they get themselves in the middle of claims, they get themselves, citizens kind of getting citizen feelings about how the town should appropriate money. And of course the town could conceivably appropriate the money if the town voted to do so at a town meeting. But that's a tough call. I think towns can, so as I say, I think it's a slippery slope. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I asked that question of an Iberviller employee, and he told me that when there's an issue afterwards, when there's a problem with, say, sound, and he told me that at that point it is of no concern to them that it would be between the landowner, the homeowner, and the town. Those words came out of his mouth. And I have another question. Could you elaborate on the second homeowners? You said something about that. The second homeowners in this town pay about 60%.
I would imagine that Grafton has a kind of a second homeowner issue, whether they think that second homeowners should vote on this or shouldn't vote on this. That will depend, I think, on how you kind of set it up.
Well, what is legal? I mean, if we're doing it by a
it's not the kind of thing that lends itself easily to a legal opinion. I mean, if you want second homeowners to vote and they aren't normal voters in the town and on the voting rules of the town, then you basically have to say so and have it an informal advisory vote as opposed to a true town meeting, special town meeting vote. And that's about all I can say. I mean, I haven't done many towns. I don't have much experience in that. I mean, Sheffield, Lowell, Benson, New Haven, there are not a lot of second homes there.
Here there are a lot of second homes there, and as the lady said, there's more than 50% of the property taxes paid by second homes. The
the homeowner, the non-resident homeowner, have petitioned the select board to be included. There's 90+ non-residents who want to be included, and I'm sure that number will go up. The other town that this project will be built on, Wyndham, which would be 20 of the 28 towers, in fact, is including second homeowners in their referendum. So,
No.
Yes, they are.
No, they're not.
Yes, they are. They're sending out ballots. They're different color ballots, and they're going to get back.
All I can tell you is, I think the town can decide. Oh, incidentally,
So the town can decide. That's what people should understand. The town can set the rules for this.
I would think so,
process.
yeah. I mean, I think there are mechanisms for the town to express itself. What these guys come in and say is, we're not going to do it unless the town is in favor. What I'm telling you is, I think they do need the town as a practical matter. Now, I can't tell you 100% that that's the case. It's not a legal opinion. It's just, I think, a practical opinion. And but I think that then the town can kind of decide how it's going to do it. Incidentally, the only people who commit the town to a contract is the select board. So normally, in my experience, the select board will say, first the developer might say, the way they're saying now, if the town doesn't want us, we're not going to do it. If the select board, if there's a vote, in my experience, the select board will see what their marching orders are. Having now sat through a half of a select board meeting here, I'm not too sure. Yes.
In Sheffield, originally Sutton was part of that whole deal, and I've been trying to find out how did it come to be that Sheffield went ahead with it, but Sutton was dropped. Somewhere in the PSB hearings.
They reconfigured the array so that they pulled those 4 wind machines from Sheffield, Sutton into Sheffield.
Was that because of pressure from
Yeah,
Sutton?
I think it was because of pressure from Sutton.
So that's what
It might be similar here, if you people feel strongly enough that you don't want anything to do with them, they might, I don't know where those wires run and what the whole thing is, but they might just say, well, okay, we want to go ahead
Okay, thank you. I never could figure it out in all the reading how that.
You're right. You're absolutely right. It kind of happened quickly at the last minute, but it happened as they were kind of filing it with the Public Service Board. So it was by the time they kind of adjusted the maps and stuff, the case was going, and that was what was going. So what you didn't see was the kind of run-up to that filing.
Okay.
You couldn't find maps.
No.
Haven't both times. Yes, ma'am.
Is it also, my name is Andrea Dunminer, is it also true that after the contracts are signed with the towns, that the facility that is bringing in the project can change their specs and the town has to accept it? But yet the town must stick by all of the items in the contract?
Well, you would want a clause in the contract that any changes would go back to the town. That oddly enough, because they do change projects, that hasn't come up much in my experience. I don't know about other people's experience, but the question has to do with changes and whether after a contract is signed, we always want to anticipate that in the contract, it seems to me. As a practical matter, what happens is it gets into a slightly fluid process in the Public Service Board. Somebody from wetlands will come up and say, well, you can't locate here, but you can locate there. And then everybody starts kind of readjusting. But I haven't seen big readjustments. I think the biggest one that I've seen is that one in Sheffield or something. so I can't tell you from experience that I've seen a lot of that. Yes, sir.
What you've been describing seems to be a process of developing a contract and then a vote at the moment when this is the contract, yes or no. It would be interesting to know if any of the towns at that point said no. But what would another process look like if people said, we don't want this, that more money doesn't take away, terrible sound or ruining the character of the town? What would a process look like to not get it up to the point of a contract? If you said, we don't want this here, how would you look at a process using an attorney that would try to stop it, given with what might be going on in Montpelier or influences in Washington? What would the possibility be to try to stop it, slow it, not make it happen before you get to the point of a contract?
I think the first thing I would probably do, and this is just speaking for myself because I hang out in Montpelier, but I probably would go to every department head of every department that feeds into this process in the Public Service Board and tell them this town doesn't want anything to do with these things, this is why. And kind of push against the lobbyists for lawyers for the project. I then urge the state agencies to have nothing to do with it, really make a strong case. Then I think, you never quite know how much to take them at their word. I think if their word is that they won't do it without town approval, I tend to take them at their word, but as Al, I think, quite rightly said, there's always the possibility they could flip it. They could flip and then the next owner has a perfect right to walk into the Public Service Board and ask for a certificate of public good, at which point, if they try that, number one, as I say, you lobby the state agencies, but number two, you oppose it. And you hire a lawyer, go in the Public Service Board, and hire experts and go after it. And I realize this is a sexist thing to say, but I have more faith in the Public Service Board right now because it has 2 women on it out of the 3 commissioners than I ever had. They're making more reasonable decisions, and they knocked out a solar array in Bennington for aesthetic reasons. I don't think the old board would have even begun that. Having been, long ago I was on the Public Service Board, and I know the dynamic. It tends to be the legislature's pounding on you to get these renewables in. There becomes a kind of a macho thing. Are you willing to, do this? And are you man enough to do it, and so on? I think it's great there are 2 women on it because they're not gonna listen to that. And they've already shown a tendency to be more sensitive to public concerns. I don't know that I've really answered your question, but yeah, you go in and you fight it. If push comes to shove, you've got to go in and fight it. And that's going to cost the town something, but you probably by that time will feel it's worth doing. Yes, sir.
Given the fact that all of this project is on private land and that none of the land belongs to this town, doesn't that put a different twist on it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it in effect allows them, I don't know how much they might have to use town rights of way or anything, but yeah, it allows them, in the final analysis, they can go to the Public Service Board just as any developer can, any utility can, and ask what they want to ask for. And, you know, and then you duke it out. The Public Service Board is under tremendous work pressure. And the reason I would go to state agencies is that they, because of the sort of kind of colorful analogy on a former chair of the Public Service Board told me it was like standing under a barn when the manure chute was coming out. But you know, they're just under constant pressure from the legislature and from parties before them. And so they rely heavily on state agencies, which is why I would go to state agencies. They rely heavily on the Department of Public Service, which is supposed to represent the public in these things. And don't get me started, some of the current administration hasn't endeared itself to a lot of people on that score. Yes, sir.
I've done a lot of research on you. You have a tremendous background in this area, all the way from Quebec, all the way through Vermont and New Hampshire. Catherine Flagg interviewed you in 2012, and I wondered what your current feeling was about some statements that are now 4 years old, whether things are improved or whether there's a higher warning signal. The article says, while he will continue to play a vital role in those transactions, Saudek is in no rush to entertain more wind proposals. Looking ahead, he predicts that Vermont, quote unquote, may want to take a deep breath after the current crop of wind farms go online. Quote unquote, it is hard to know how we will look back on this in 20 years. This was in 2012. We are now 1/5 of the way through that 20 years. We're in 2016. And I'd just like to hear how you reflect on those comments from 2012 and where we are today. Have things gotten better, or are they more tenuous?
I think that I think Vermont is turning against wind development. I mean, that's the and I don't, you know, I don't want to, you know, presuppose any particular bias in this, but I think, but I think that's happening. I think it was the noise that did it, because it was such a surprise. You know, we used to see pictures of these things going around, and just kind of, you know, kind of in a casual way, they'd be off in the distance and stuff, and everybody thought, oh, you know, wind and so on. That's no longer the case. I mean, we now know the details of these things, for better or worse. And I think there's much more skepticism of wind power than there was at that time. That was 2012 would have been, I don't know, after the Sheffield and possibly Lowell, I guess. And Lowell may have been in the regulatory process at that point. I don't know whether they had to face. That's the other thing, the big thing about Lowell. And I don't know anything about this, but one of the things that really got people in Lowell was the big roads and the kind of scraping off the top of the mountain, the ridge there. But Lowell, you know, those of you who know Lowell, maybe you all do, but you know, Route 100 goes straight up through that town, and this ridge line goes right next to Route 100. And when those things start going, you think the whole town's going to lift up. I mean, you know, this whole big line of big wind machines. It's quite different from Sheffield, where they're kind of scattered a bit. You can see them easily from the interstate from the north in Sheffield, but not so much from other places. Yes, ma'am.
Could you please step back for just a moment?
Could you be louder, please?
One of the things that I've heard, debate or different points of view about in this discussion is what gets the whole thing going, what gets the process going. I've heard that there's a proposal that is due to us from Iberdrola. What, in your experience, is the prime mover of this process? And when, in the timeline, does the community have an opportunity to express itself? do we have to negotiate the entire contract and then vote, or is there another step along the way? And do we get some form of proposal from Iberdrola to start the whole process?
If a developer is determined to develop a project, that developer can walk into the Public Service Board under normal circumstances and start developing it. Iberdrola here has decided to, try to get the towns to agree to it, which is a wise thing, because as I say, I think they need you. But the momentum of the project, I don't know whether I can really answer you exactly about at what point is the trigger point that starts it. I think it's already started here, but the formal trigger point is the filing of a 45-day notice with the Public Service Board. But they'd be crazy to file that if they didn't at least think they had a deal here. And probably wouldn't file it until they had a vote here. I don't know. I mean, you kind of have to ask them. I know their lobbyists are. Is Alex involved in this one? Yeah. Okay. Well, their lobbyists, they're very nice one day and not so nice the next day. You never know what side of the bed they got up on in the morning, but I will say this, and I will say that they have responsible attorneys, but those attorneys have done very well in getting projects okay, getting certificates of public good for projects, for fairly large projects. They bring down 1,000 megawatts under a cable, the one that goes down through the lake and comes up at Benson. That's a big project. That's the equivalent of the Vermont load, 1,000 megawatts. And they're just going to bring it down and send it south down to. But I think the answer is that it's a kind of a process. I mean, they control they've got their hand on the lever of the timing to a great extent. But the fact is that if they want the support of the town, then the town has much more leverage. Here apparently they do. I don't know how else to answer that, but I don't know whether that's a very good answer. But I could just say what a typical developer would do who didn't care about getting the town involved. Then the developer would just go, file a 45-day notice, apply for the system impact study, and they're off and running.
Maybe just one follow-up then. When you talked about the project description being step number 1, is that the same thing we're calling the proposal from Iberdrola?
Yeah, except that what I'm talking about is a project description after people from the town have weighed in on it. I mean, my point on that, and I mean it to be an important point. My point is that you don't have to take the package they're offering you in terms of deciding this thing. If you've got ideas as to how it could be changed, you can talk to them. If you don't want it at all, then you don't have to talk to them too much, right? Just tell them to get out of town.
What happens if the town is genuinely conflicted?
I don't have a legal opinion. The question is, what happens if the town is genuinely conflicted? I think we're already there. Don't worry about it. Yeah. I don't know how to answer that question, honestly. I think, the way we do it with the contract process, I think if the town really doesn't want to go forward at all with even considering this kind of thing, that's fine. But the way we do it with the contract process is we try to, you know, feed back in. We try to get feedback from people as to what they think is reasonable in the contract. But you don't want a contract if you don't want it under any circumstances. You don't want it under any circumstances. And I don't know any other way to answer it other than you depose it.
Mr. Saudek, as noted, the Terrans in Sheffield basically had their lives ruined. And they've tried to get help from the town and from Meadows End, and they've got nothing. Also, as noted, our project is far bigger than theirs. The turbines are far bigger, and we have a lot of people in Grafton, Townsend, and Wyndham that are going to be closer. So it's inevitable, I think, that people are going to get sick and have their lives ruined. And these people, most of these people can't afford to sue Iberdrola. They're going to be destroyed, and they're not going to have anything, like the Terrians. And so I just want to be sure I understood what you said, that you know, the contracts you negotiate, there could be no provisions to help those people.
You know, I think if the town wanted to be prepared to compensate people, help them move, buy them out, or whatever, the town can do that, and the town can decide to do that. And it can take it out of the money they're getting from the wind machines. To some degree, being the lawyer for Sheffield, I was hearing something of another side of that story, although I am very much aware of the fact that the Therians have become well known as people who suffered from having these wind machines near them. And I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but I was concerned, as the lawyer for the town, I was concerned that the town be very careful about getting in the middle of claims. I mean, you can imagine why, aside from, but if the town wants to vote some money for them, or if the town wants to set up a fund, take a certain amount of that money and set up a fund instead of doing, you know, what it might otherwise do with the money, that is a judgment the town makes. I will tell you that I would expect the developers to be pretty tough on that stuff, because you get an outfit like Iberdrola that has wind farms all over the place, all over northern New York State, everywhere else. I don't know much about the western ones, but I do know they're all over New York. And if they're concerned about precedent, would be my guess, about compensation of people with claims against them. And so they would tend probably to fight them unless, you know, unless they felt it was a relatively low figure. So yeah, I would think the town could provide for that. I don't know whether that needs to be in a contract, but if that's what the town wants, then fine. I mean, the town every year, in my experience, the towns vote what to do with their money. They vote whether to give themselves tax relief, whether to build a ball field, whether to, you know, build a new highway garage, or fire station, whatever.
Just a quick one. Why wouldn't that be the utilities' responsibility? Why would that?
Well, it should be the utilities' responsibility, but I think he's right, that as a practical matter, they're going to say, listen, you've got your legal rights, go to court and prove them. I mean, and I've got to tell you that, I mean, I don't mean to be insensitive, but as far as I know, Iberdrola is not known for its sensitivity. And, you know, if somebody said to them, your wind machine is ruining my life, they start making a calculation. Is this going to be another Therian case where we're going to look insensitive, and we're going to be in the Vermont press and all over. And you know what? The guys who ran the wind machines up there decided, yeah, it is, and tough. We're going to tough it out. Iberdrola might take another tack, but I don't think you have to be realistic. I mean, I think they will probably fight it. There are some. I could recommend a couple of lawyers who could probably eat them alive at the Vermont courts, but and that would not be me. Although,
But couldn't that be written into the contract?
I love new things. That's another story.
I mean, couldn't that be written into the contract that if it made people in the town sick, the utility would be responsible for?
You might be able to, but that would become a bone of real contention. The closest I've come in that is this appraisal setup in New Haven, and I'm not so sure that's going to yield a great deal of satisfaction. It's a tough call. It's all, I realize I'm dancing around. I don't know how
Pretty
else
much
to
the
answer.
people living near these projects are pretty much screwed. The ones that are really close are pretty much screwed if this goes through.
Or very rich. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You don't want people. You don't want a project that is really close to you.
And this project is
This
really
project
close to a lot of people.
Tell them to get out of town.
Who makes the contractor that decision on the bone of contention? I mean, if it's written in the contract, who strikes it out? Or who argues? Does the Public Service Board have anything to say about that? Are they going to take it out? Or is it a negotiated?
You don't want to either.
Why would
you want somebody who says, I'm going to build a gas pipeline down the western part of the state, plus you're going to have 90% renewables. They're going to be hell-bent for leather for renewables.
And what about Joe Blow or Joe Jones, the fellow that's sick? He can't afford to go against an $85 billion company. So he's defenseless.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the town of Rockingham would against TransCanada.
So he should.
More than that.
Yeah, well, that's.
Well, this is an actual.
I don't think
That brings an addition to the 101 North. These are buildings, they're not special. That's scary.
Yes, ma'am.
I think that the reason, this is just my opinion, that Iberdrola may not want to agree to putting something like that in the contract is because we probably already have some of those people who are closer to the project than others who are already decided that they are going to be sick from this project. It is going to ruin their lives. They're going to gush blood from their nose, or their ears are going to fall off or something. So that's probably why they would want to agree to putting something in the contract.
I think you're probably right. On the other hand, if they really want to build this project, they might be able to work something out. But I just was just shown this chart with what,
121.
121 within a mile
For a window only.
Within a mile of the project. That's a lot.
That's a lot, that's a lot.
I don't think I've ever handled a project where they were that close.
That's, I think, really
That many that close.
The contract is really just an illusion, because once the contract is in force, if anybody develops problems, it's chasing, it's litigation. I think you said it yourself, you quoted it saying, give us the money, sayonara, and I know it wasn't reference to that, but that's how it's, from what my understanding, the research I've done, is how they've treated residents in Leominster, for instance, and other areas, let alone Sheffield, is that once it's done, Okay, then you got to chase them. And you said it's litigation, it's litigation, it's litigation. People can't afford litigation. So the real thing is to unite the town together to stop this from happening, so we don't go to contract, that there is no contract, that the town speaks unanimously, okay, and say, no, you know, it's not worth the health of one of our neighbors, no matter what the money is. The contract shouldn't be presented with these people here have to decide that.
Well, I mean, you're basically saying a contract isn't worth the paper it's written on because as a practical matter, it's difficult to enforce, right? I disagree.
I mean, people have
contracts.
suffered for years going through the process of trying to, you know, salvage their homes and their lives through litigation, but they lived in these adverse conditions.
Well, I've tried to lay it out realistically. I haven't tried to suggest that I don't know what to tell you. I mean,
it's just bad.
I feel that
it's bad if there's no recourse.
Yeah, they're a big company.
We've got good lawyers in Vermont, but I don't know what to tell you. I mean, we beat TransCanada. They're pretty big.
How's a town? One other individual.
Yes. Is there anybody? Yes, sir.
I got 3 questions. One, you said something about making big roads. Have you seen in your experience them rebuilding or improving town roads to get to their property?
That can be, I think if they affect town roads, or if they could do any damage to town roads, or if they say they need to increase the size of them or run something under them or something like that, then they pick up the bill for any of that. And I think that's pretty clear, and I don't think that they would have any serious argument with that. I don't know. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Sort of. Yeah.
That's the closest I can come tonight.
So the selectmen would look at what they wanted to do and say yes or no, or do this or do that.
Benson, it's all about they're going under town roads.
Yeah.
And this is a cable that goes under town roads. And, there's no question that they have to do it, and they have to do it under the supervision of the Benson Road Commissioner, and they have to pay for it entirely.
So this is an item that should be in the contract should we get to a contract?
Yep.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions to how we would be sure about the decommissioning funds and where do they reside? Where do they go? Where does the escrow land?
What they do is I think this is kind of an imperfect solution, to tell the truth. But they generally, the way the PSB rigs it is the PSB makes them give a bond to the PSB in the name of the PSB to cover decommissioning. I haven't had much experience in the kind of end result of that. I do know the PSB keeps an eye on it because I've seen situations where they've flipped the project to a new owner and the new owner said, well, we're going to kind of change this bond around, and the PSB came down pretty hard on them and said, you're not going to change it around if you want to operate this project. And but I haven't seen it come up very much. That's really only one instance where I've seen the way they've handled it. And I would have to get back to you on particulars about some of these bonds and so on. I can't honestly tell you that I'm that familiar with the way, but I do know that that's the way they handle it.
How does the amount of the decommissioning fund get established?
Well, they just try to project it, Once again, I'd have to get the details to you. It's been a long time since I've really dealt with that.
So we should probably have an expert in that field if we get to that point.
You might want, well, yeah, I mean, there are a dime a dozen all around Vermont, and these guys who will set up, will take a present value and feed it into the computer, shoot it out there. I can almost do that, but you probably just don't spend too much on it, because that one's pretty easy to come by. What would it cost today, and what's it going to cost in the future? You might want an engineer who is familiar with wind machines to tell you what it would cost in present dollars to take it out of there. I'm sorry, I'm not good at that particular issue.
If we ask for a fund to be escrowed for legal fees, how much would you suggest we ask for?
Well, in the first place, lawyers always get blamed, and perhaps rightly so, but it's not just legal fees. Usually the sound person would have to do a pretty fair amount of work, and then there would be other people who would do somewhat less work. But, I would say with a project this size, with the kind of controversiality that it's caused and so on, and there's going to be, if you really get into it, and I can see that there's a lot of citizens who are going to be feeding into this process, which makes it more complicated. Am I dancing around yet?
Yeah.
I would think I would tell them you certainly want to start with 100 grand. I don't think just to get to a contract you would go through that. As a matter of fact, you might not go through half of it. It depends. By the time the sound people do cost, and the lawyers definitely do cost. I mean, even lawyers who give a town a break on their hourly rates, it mounts up, there's no question.
Mr. Saudek, thank you. Could I ask for your recommendation on the situation that you spoke to earlier, that sometimes the permit process is done and then it's immediately sold? What would be the motivation for Iberdrola to come in and permit and immediately sell? And is it at all tied to the fact that there are huge subsidies that come up front, and once they receive those, they're on the move, and now we're into a subsidiary of that, and it's very hard for us to deal with that. They've received $2.3 billion in subsidies over the last 6 years. Should they come here and permit and then immediately sell? What can we do in our contract to prevent them from being able to do that?
You can see whether they'll sign something that requires they hold on to it for 5 years or something like that, it would seem to me.
Have you seen that?
That may be a tough sell with them. No, I haven't. I haven't done that. What I've tried to do is come in the back end and tie up anybody who might buy the project. I think this is a fast-moving game. You've all read about renewable energy credits. You've read about probably arbitraging electricity between power pools. You've probably read about system impact studies and all, and about tax breaks and so on. But it's such a changing environment. They're in a changing environment too. I mean, if somebody suddenly decides not to give them a tax break, all of a sudden all bets are off as far as they're concerned. They're not going to be making their numbers. And you're dealing with, in this business, to me, it's breathtaking. I mean, we're sitting here in Lowell, Vermont, and we've got the biggest hedge fund in the world has invested in one of these Lake Champlain cables. The biggest transmission company in the Northeast is another one. The Iberdrola, one of the biggest in the world, Gaz de France, another huge energy combine, has gotten involved. in just south of our border down Massachusetts on some of these hydro plants. And TransCanada, which is, I forget how big it is, but it's big, huge. So, you know, it makes you wonder, what is it? Is it our scenery?
We've got a few more things on the agenda.
Well, go ahead.
Well, you did well. You did well.
Thank you very much.
Kind of just a list of a few things and put them in the
All right, very good.
Thank you. Good night.